Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you in the UK, and a huge welcome to all of you to this British American Business webinar, during which we are going to be talking about ESG issues, their impact and their implications for businesses. This is the first in a series of events that we're going to be running in our new corporate citizenship and sustainability series, which we're going to be running through a series of webinars and roundtables over the next 6 months, up to and through COP26 in November. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the supporters of this series for helping to make it happen. They are Debevoise and Plimpton, Fitch Ratings, and Letter One. Clearly, look, this is an enormous subject, and it's taking up more and more time for boards and for CEOs than ever before, quite rightly. So it's appropriate for us to use our convening platform to dig into these issues. To guide us today through those issues and to moderate the discussion with our expert panel, I'm delighted that we have Kay Forsyth. Kay is a partner in the financial services practice at Deloitte in London, where she leads on ESG strategy and transformation. So, Kay, thanks for doing this with us today, and over to you.
Duncan, thank you so much. And indeed, a very warm welcome to everybody, our nearly 100 participants so far, whether it be morning, afternoon or evening, and indeed wherever you are in the world. So just very quickly, we are here for this next hour. We're going to briefly have a presentation from Mervyn Tang, who will be talking to us around Fitch's 2021 ESG Credit Trend Report. And then we're going to have a curated thematic conversation with our panelists. That's going to take us for about 40 minutes, and there'll certainly be time at the end, if we can, for open questions and answers from all of you listening. So you're going to be in listen-only mode for the duration of the panel conversation, the presentation and panel conversation. Please do submit your questions using the chat feature, and then we can come to those at the end. The session is being recorded, and so you'll be able to request that from the team to listen at your leisure later on and whenever you want to come back to it. So I think that's it in terms of our housekeeping and the programme flow. Let me just introduce then our brilliant panel today, and thank you so much, panel. We'll go through super quick. Marisa Buchanan.
Hi. Good morning, Kay, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. And then we've also got Amit Puri.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I am trying to turn my camera on, but it seems to not be playing ball. So thrilled to be here today and speaking with you shortly.
And Mervyn Tang.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. Good evening to you from Hong Kong, and I'm excited to join this discussion.
Thank you, Mervyn. And Patricia, last but by no means least.
Thank you, Kay. Yes, hi, everyone. I'm Patricia. Nice to meet you. I'm a partner at Debevoise and Plimpton, based in Frankfurt and London.
Thank you all. So we've got a fantastic geographic spread, time zone spread as well across the panel, let alone our attending members. Let's get straight into it. Mervyn, I wonder if I could invite you just to take us through those high-level findings from your current credit trend report. About 8 minutes on this, and then I think that'll set the stage for us to flow into the discussion with the panel.
Great. Let me share my screen then and start and get this going. Computer not quite playing ball like Amit was before, but should be fine, hopefully in not too long.
The trials and tribulations of the world of Zoom.
Really is quite complicated. Let me just There we go, it's just right at the end. Can everyone see my screen? Just checking quickly.
Yes, we can, Mervyn.
Fantastic. So, well, very glad to be here. I'm Mervyn Tang. I head ESG research at ESG research at Fitch Ratings. And so I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction on the ESG trends that we see for 2021. But I think before I start, I'm just going to go into why is something like Fitch looking at ESG and sustainability in the first place? Because I think it's an important question. We've been getting asked by investors, from banks, from issuers, everyone on ESG. And for us, I think ESG can mean a lot of different things to different people. It can be the sustainability, environmental performance of an entity. It could be the quality of governance. For us, the questions we're getting are more specific as a credit rating agency. It's how do ESG issues exactly affect our credit risk assessment? Kind of important to distinguish what we mean here, because if you're thinking about ESG, I'm sure you'll be hearing all sorts of buzzwords on, oh, okay, what is the net zero emission pledge this company is giving? What is their carbon intensity? What is their strategy? These are important things of environmental performance, but they can also be important from a financial perspective. So the fact that carbon pricing regulation is tightening in some regions, not all regions, some regions, means that the cost is going to be passed through to companies in some way. The exact amount that cost pass through will depend on the business model, whether it can pass it on to its customers, its regulatory framework. There's kind of a lot of different things when it comes to how these ESG issues can transmit into credit ratings. And so we wanted to systemically help our analysts start to understand these issues, which people are caring much more about. So since January 2019, we have launched the system called ESG Relevance Scores for over 10,000 issuers, transactions, programs across corporate, structured finance, sovereigns, just our all asset class gamut. And they will be assigning 1 to 5 on environmental issues based on how material they see and how material and how relevant they see ESG risks are to their credit rating decisions. Now, what does that all mean and what did this result in? So I talked about the corporates portfolio and the bank's financial institutions portfolio. What we found was around 20% of corps and FIs have been impacted by ESG issues in some way in credit ratings. If we look at the sector split, governance is important in pretty much all cases. So this is unsurprising because way before the ESG acronym was used, governance was a core part of credit rating criteria. The governance issues might vary slightly by sector, but it's a common theme. Where we see a bit more variation is on environmental and social risks. So clearly sectors like utilities, natural resources, where there's more carbon emissions, the more exposures to potential regulations are going to be more exposed to the potential for kind of environmental risks and regulations to come through. Whereas in the social side, it's more sectors that are exposed to customers and potential populist movements. So one example would be people caring more about drug prices and the affordability of drugs, and that's going to hit the pricing power of pharmaceuticals. And so these stories started materializing in our analysis of kind of how ESG is affecting credit ratings. The chart on your left shows you the kind of snapshot from March, and the chart on your right shows you what changes in impact we have seen. And it's a similar story. Because governance is most impactful, you also see the most change in impact. But where that is a bit more interesting is something like utilities, where it's the most exposed sector to environmental risks, but the increase is less than, say, industrials and transportation. And one of the reasons is that the EU emission trading system, emission trading scheme has always been part of the utilities framework, but increasingly expanding to industrials like steel, cement, and fertilizers, for example. So there's both interesting revelations that come out from looking at the absolute of our kind of ESG score process, as well as the changes. Now, this is a British American business seminar, so I want to go a little bit on the geographics side of things as well. So if we look at the geographics, governance risks is much more common in emerging markets. That shouldn't shock anyone. But the types of emerging market issues are different. So concentrated ownership, financial transparency, much more common emerging markets, multinationals having complex structures, related party transactions, more common in developed markets. The interesting thing is that social risks are more common in developed markets, because how we see it is that governments tend to be more reactive to social issues when it comes to policy response in developed markets, whereas emerging markets, social issues often end up arising more in terms of societal tensions. And so the nature of the risk response is a bit different. On terms of environmental risks, developed market Europe, including the UK, is more ahead in terms of tightening of carbon regulation. And so the impact on credits in turn is also higher. It is interesting that in Europe, we have been seeing more impact in terms of increases in environmental risk, in part, I think, because there is so much more in development when it comes to EU regulation. But this is kind of the overall aggregate scoring, and here's how we see it. What's interesting is we have looked at these scores and we've asked analysts the stories that come out, and we've come up with some ESG trends that we see for 2021. So one thing that everyone's going to talk about is the huge amount of disclosure requirements, huge amount of data. Now, this is important, we think, because it's going to affect how banks and asset managers allocate their capital, allocate lending, allocate investments. So one example of a US entity which we downgraded is CoreCivic, a private prison operator. And we saw a number of US global banks pull out financing from that. They were exposed to financing flexibility issues in the first place. But it's an example of how banks are having a real impact on corporates. And with the increase in data, we only expect that impact to increase. The second trend we see is a broadening of ESG across credit. So everyone's heard about green bonds. The more recent innovation is sustainability-linked instruments, where instead of having a use of proceeds that are sustainable, the bonds are linked to a key performance indicator. I mean, an important part of what we've seen here is that the sustainability-linked sector distribution is much wider. You're seeing pharmaceuticals, you're seeing retail, you're seeing all sorts of companies issuing those bonds, whereas green bonds were more weighted towards renewables, real estate, and assets where the use of proceeds were more defined. So we're seeing ESG broadening, and that's kind of affecting our financing views. Now, here's a free kind of environmental social governance risk to kind of end this this introduction. On the environmental side, the most important thing, unsurprisingly, is the kind of raft of net zero pledges that are being made. The challenge with what we have done with our analysis is lots of net zero pledges, not much on policy clarity. And then to achieve net zero pledges, we need to understand, is gas going to be part of it? Is biofuels going to be part of it? Is nuclear going to be part of the equation? And all these questions are still not quite there yet. There's a lot of political and social debate on exactly the right path to net zero. And I think what we'll see is more clarity about this coming through, and we'll also see that materialize into a credit impact over time. On the social side, we think the most important risk is really just a result of the pandemic. So since the pandemic, clearly inequality and poverty has increased just because of the huge impact across economies. We've noticed this in a few ESG relevant sectors where there's been more and more concerns around kind of the social license to operate of companies. So we increased the ESG relevance scores for a number of consumer lending, high interest consumer lenders who have increased their activities during the pandemic, unsurprisingly, because people have needed money and needed consumer loans. But the potential for those loans to go wrong and the scrutiny that ESG investors are going to place on those banks that are collecting these loans, we think that these type of social issues are just going to be emerging from the new normal once the pandemic sets in. Last but not least is governance. And I think governance people often think about is, do you have an audit committee? Is your board of directors independent? Just pure traditional governance ideas. I think where we're seeing a shift is there's an increasing conversation about governance of sustainability issues. How are boards responsible for sustainable duties? How is their pay going to be linked? Are they meant to be understanding more information about the company's supply chain as well as the company itself? And that does mean we think that governance, sustainability is going to influence company strategy even more than now, well, in the future than now. So that's our ESG credit trends. Hopefully that gives a nice brief overview, and for the rest of the panel to start sharing their thoughts on whether we're along the right lines or they completely disagree.
Mervyn, thank you so much. And I think, frankly, you could have this panel conversation on any one of those boxes on that last slide that we had in front of us there. I'm going to start by picking up this theme around governance and conduct, but link it. Patricia, if I can come to you first, because one of the things that I think we're seeing, which plays across the whole of that piece, very much into the governance piece, is the emergence of this different and complex, and we certainly, I mean, who knows where we will end up around regulation in the different markets that each of you as panelists, but equally our listeners will be sitting in. Can you just give us your view around what we can expect and whether there is to what extent people are going to use regulation as being a tick box, stick exercise versus how we actually get it to impact leadership and make the kind of strategic change that Mervyn was talking about?
Yeah, thank you, Kay. I think there is probably a little bit of both. I should say. I think we are clearly seeing a shift in behavior among financial market participants, as Maren was describing. I think, you know, where we saw or have been seeing ESG being sort of part of the risk management analysis for financial market participants, it sort of slowly, you know, seems to be moving towards a valuation actually topic. And the whole regulation that we're seeing in Europe, in particular the SFDR, is really making that difference also, because we have products where you sort of tick the box for the minimum, where all you do is actually you have to disclose how you take the ESG risks into consideration in your due diligence process. So that's exactly what Maren was describing. You know, I mean, ESGs are risks that, you know, in particular, if you're doing long-term investments, that have to be considered. And so that is something that financial market participants already do or have been doing for a while, but now they have to disclose it. Now they have to show as to the method they're using in that regard. So that's sort of the risk management aspect to it. But then if you go beyond that, and many financial market participants want to go beyond that, then you would not only look at the risks, but you would also look at the impact of your investment or your investment decision or your behavior on external factors, on ESG factors. So irrespective of how your asset in which you're investing develops, you would also do what we call a no significant harm test. You would actually check whether, or you know, principal adverse impacts, or they're different sort of categories, and depending on how you qualify under that regulation. But they have in common that in addition to looking at the risks for your investment asset, you also have to look at the external impact of your doing. And that is actually, I think, new, and that is sort of definitely something that will shift behavior. Many are doing it already. I'll say they are doing it, but now under this new regulation, what they're trying to do is that if you say that you take into account principal adverse impacts on ESG factors, then that means something specifically under that new regulation. And that's where the challenge will be. It's, you know, they're trying to avoid greenwashing, and so making sure that products get comparable, and that where you say you're being an impact fund, then that means the same, or an impact product, that this means the same to all financial market participants in the European market. But
yeah, I think that's right. And actually, there's an interesting piece here. So Amit, can I just take this to you, because within Standard Chartered, you have got an extraordinary geographic reach, not only in these more mature regulated markets that perhaps Patricia was referring to some extent there, but you've got the whole of the developing market landscape as well, which brings its own challenges. So how has that impacted your thinking about how you address both the need to cover and prioritize the different emerging risks in this space, but also how you deal with these particular challenges and risks in the emerging market landscape?
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know much about Standard Chartered, we're a UK headquartered bank, but the majority of our business is concentrated in emerging markets across Asia, Africa, and Middle East, about 60 different countries. And so that's how the bank's always been set up. And so when the environmental and social risk management team, the team I head up, was set up about 20 years ago, it was always with a lens as to, well, we're a UK headquartered bank, but how do we manage these risks in emerging markets? And in some ways that put us ahead of the pack of some of our peers, because we were going out into emerging markets and we were trying to manage these particular risks. The simplest way to answer the question is, we take a market agnostic approach. So when we look at environmental risks or we look at social risks, we say, well, we don't want you to be causing any significant harm, to use Patricia's terminology and the taxonomy, in any market that you're in. You're not allowed to get away with causing harm in the US or the Europe and not in emerging markets, or vice versa. So we take a fairly market agnostic approach. Where it does become very interesting, though, is particularly when we're talking about transition and some of the increase in focus on this agenda as well, how different markets, in particular in our footprint, are at different stages of their maturity. So where the UK, the European Union, the US to some extent, we've got regulation coming out, or we have regulation already. Emerging markets are a bit behind the curve. Now, where Europe is leading, we're certainly seeing countries like Singapore, we're seeing Hong Kong actually modeling their own frameworks from an ESG risk management perspective on what the EU has been doing. But that's where we sort of see some challenge. And the other place is really where our clients are. So clients in emerging markets want to save people, they want to protect the planet, but they just have a different starting point. And they don't necessarily have the same set of support networks, if you like. And by that, I really mean government incentives or government approach to this particular agenda. And so sometimes private enterprise is leading where governments are falling behind. So we have sort of multiple angles, but the starting point is to have a market agnostic approach, because the environment, it's people, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We want to make sure that they're protected.
Thank you. We're getting some great questions coming in as well. So thank you for everyone who started to send those in, and we're going to pick those up as we go, even if we leave a little bit of extra time at the end. Marisa, actually, one thing I would love to pick up with you if we come on to it then is, when you take this within your organization and think about the company you keep, your clients and customers, how have you started to focus your attention down that supply chain in terms of looking at greater scrutiny on them and their readiness to meet the standards you are now expecting of them? Because there may be some people perhaps on this call as well who would fall into that community. How's that changing your way of operation and engagement with clients?
Okay, you can hear that.
Oh,
so that's
yeah.
Okay, yeah, I put these headphones in, so they weren't working. Okay, so I'm not going to use them. So thanks so much for that question. It's so interesting. We've really watched, and I've been at JP Morgan for almost a decade now. I mean, their societal expectations of business are changing, and they've been changing all around the world. And I think a lot of this started in Europe, and it's now hitting North America and has been for a number of years. Asia, obviously. And, what this means is, I think, institutions like ours, and obviously Amit here as well, have, been putting increased focus on, the impacts that, that we have through the clients that we finance, in addition to thinking about how we manage our own operational footprints. And it's been interesting to watch, climate really become, I think, the #1 environmental issue that we and our clients have been focused on, although that's not to say that it's the only environmental issue that exists out there. There are others as well. But I think we have really been seeing a combination of government policy, regulation changing shareholder expectations. I think that now is a huge force and trend that we've all been watching, along with combination of activism, changing civil society expectations, and the expectations of companies, clients, and customers. These are huge motivating tools that are really leading, financial institutions, but also our clients to put greater emphasis around how they manage environmental impacts and climate change in particular. So, for us at JP Morgan, we've been doing a lot of work on all of these issues in recent years. I'm really proud to say that today we released our 2020 Environmental, Social, and Governance report, and as part of that, published our carbon intensity targets for 3 key sectors: oil and gas, electric power, and automotive manufacturing, that are part of a commitment that we announced last fall to align our financing activities with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so the targets that we've published today really set forth our expectations that our clients in these industries operate responsibly and also take steps to reduce their emissions so that collectively we can hopefully get on a path towards taking the steps needed to align with Paris and get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And another key piece, in addition to setting forth expectations that are codified in carbon intensity targets for these industries for 2030, we announced a few weeks ago a commitment to facilitate and finance up to $2.5 trillion in capital for companies and projects that advance the goals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as well as climate action. And we put forth specifically a $1 trillion target for climate and green. So I think of it as really, again, combination of setting forth clear expectations, but also bringing capital to bear, because our clients around the world are going to need to invest significant resources in the creation and deployment of lower carbon and other sustainable solutions. And it's really important that we think of this as a technological challenge that collectively we have to work to overcome, and an innovation challenge. And, it's very much a journey. There are a number of things that we don't have, commercially available, technology solutions for today. So there's a lot that we have to do to figure this out. But I think there is, we are seeing so much collective ambition across the financial sector, but across other industries to do more to address these key challenges. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you, Marisa. And you've started to touch there on one of our first questions that came in from Dave Allen as well. I suspect we'll come back to some of the themes in that. In doing this, and I'm going to take this question actually to Amit first, in giving this focus, Marisa, that you've just talked about there, as we create more capital and investment for transition, but in a world where the data to understand the truth of the matter in terms of what you're being told, how you're trying to assess the investment and what your clients are telling you is challenged because it's net new, and indeed you might not even be able to get the data that you want. What are your thoughts in terms of some of that downstream risk for our financial services industry writ large around the inevitability of remediation and challenges that we're all going to have to face into, and how quickly do you think we might start to run into those?
Wow, that's a nice question. Firstly, congrats to Marisa on publishing the report. I'm going to go off and read it just after this. We're about 6 months behind you. Standard Chartered announced net zero about 2 months ago, and we sort of allowed ourselves that period of time that you did to actually come up with those targets. So I shall be reaching out to you post this as well to find out how you did it. I think in terms of the question on transition and data challenges, it's huge, and I don't want to underestimate how difficult it is in developed markets, but in emerging market, it's a major impediment in some ways to access for companies to access capital. We don't have across emerging markets, and I'm sort of talking in a very generous way, the same sort of data availability that we would see coming out of Europe or North America in particular. And so when we think about it from a Standard Chartered perspective, and when we want to allocate capital, not the amounts that Marissa mentioned, we're a lot smaller as a bank, but when we want to allocate capital in emerging markets, we carry out our own bespoke analysis of clients. We engage with them. We have our own screening tools, which gives us a rich set of data in which we can make decisions from. But it is a huge challenge, and I think one of the biggest challenges we face between now and 2030 is actually getting capital into the places where it matters the most. The countries that are most going to be impacted by climate change are in emerging markets. If there is not enough data to attract that capital, what role can we play? And so we're trying to figure out how can we take this rich data that we have over many years in our footprint markets and work with the likes of Fitch or other institutions and say, well, how can we make this available to people so they can make decisions so that the capital goes to where it needs to go? But like Marissa, I'm optimistic too. I think we've got collective ambition, we've got commitments coming out on a daily basis, new acronyms and alliances, and I think we now need to just turn that into action. And I think there's the collective will there, which is great. We now just need to actually put it into action.
Thanks. Mervyn, just very briefly, what are you hearing and seeing as you cast your scan across the markets on this?
So I think it's interesting if we cast across is that the scrutiny amongst investors is growing. So I think if we look about the sophistication of questions we got a few years ago versus now, we're talking about a huge gap. Because I think when, let's say a company comes out and says, oh, we're going to achieve net zero by an X date, 2030, 2050. But then things start coming up, it's like, oh, what do you mean by net zero? Would you count for offsets usage as part of that? When you're talking about net zero, so I think Brookfield had this issue when, okay, do you also account for renewables in terms of emissions forgone? So the emissions that you end up not emitting because of the renewable investment in a country which is more filled with fossil fuels. So there's a lot of things right now where I think companies are coming out with statements and intentions of what they intend to do, but then they're getting multiple questions back on exact details and what that means and the social implications. I've seen a few questions come up on things like the social implications of some environmental strategies. I think that's a clear example where I think doing one thing can have multiple effects across the ESG spectrum. And so this makes it more difficult for companies to really approach an ESG strategy.
And Patricia, what are you seeing as regulation and the disclosure piece has to match this increasingly complex landscape? How fast are you seeing that emerging around biodiversity, water, and the blue financing piece, and then this S component of ESG as it tries to catch up, as some of those dimensions attempt to catch up with the E and climate, which kind of came first in many respects, but then there is this nuanced interlock between these. So how are you seeing that start to play out through the regulatory and disclosure lens?
Well, maybe first of all, on the sort of challenges with data collection, I share with what Mervyn and Amit said. Although I think then in Europe, clearly there is sort of the idea is to introduce these reporting requirements across the industry. So it's not only for financial market participants, but then now, we have the corporate sustainability reporting directive that is being discussed, and and that will sort of reflect exactly the same type of information under the taxonomy that then needs to be reported by the portfolio companies above a certain size, and and longer term then also for smaller companies, but in order to ensure that sort of not only the consumers of those portfolio companies, but also when the financial market participant is investing in these companies or giving credits to these companies, that they get the data in order to properly report under their own regulations. So they're really trying to make it across the chain, to make it consistent. And I think that's the only way it works, because right now, the reason why many financial market participants, for example, would actually really just do the minimum, and coming back to your first question, do the tick the box analysis and say, we are Article 6 product and we're only considering ESG risks and not going beyond that. The reason very often is that they're worried they don't get all the data they need in order to, to become, for example, an Article 8 product where they promote social and environmental criteria, because that means they have to report on an ongoing basis. They have to get the data on an ongoing basis. And that at the moment, is a challenge. So that really just, of course, for Europe, and it gets even more a challenge if you're investing outside of Europe, even though, I know China has shown interest to align, have a sort of common taxonomy with Europe. Europe has approached the US, of course. Whether there's interest in a common taxonomy remains to be seen. But I think, yes, clearly we have to work globally in order for this whole system to work. Now, where are we on the S and the G? Well, the taxonomy itself only applies at the moment to environmental sustainable investment. So, and even within that, we only have screening criteria for climate change and climate change mitigation. So it's quite limited for now, but the purpose clearly is to expand it to other environmental objectives, introduce screening criteria, but then also have taxonomy for the S. But that is, future, and I think timing is still quite uncertain, because it's already a challenge to get this environmental up and running. So we have to be, I think, there a little bit patient. On the G, I think the G is already introduced in the regulation in Europe, in that if you are in a specific category promoting environmental and social criteria, one of the conditions to be met is that your portfolio companies need to have good corporate governance in place. So that is a condition in order to be able to qualify as a product that promotes environmental and social criteria, and even more so, of course, for impact products. So that's how they have introduced it.
Thanks, Patricia. Now, at this point, I was going to prompt our audience to be submitting questions if they haven't already done so on the chat, but we have no shortage whatsoever. So we're going to start weaving these in now as we go. And just picking up what you were saying there, Patricia, around the governance frameworks. We've had a few questions. Now, what I'm not going to do is be for those of you who know the UK, in a Jeremy Passman-esque form, challenging our panelists on some of their specific corporate decisions, for those of you who are asking questions. So we're going to have a more thematic chat around some of this. But there is a theme emerging here, which perhaps goes back. There's a bit of a link here to what you were saying, Patricia, on the emergence of these governance frameworks, risk frameworks, and also this point around downstream remediation. So what do we see? And Marisa, I will start with you, and then I'm going to come to Amit as well, in terms of how fast are you having to, how agile are you having to be internally in terms of having to shift the operating model and the frameworks and the way you are operating to meet this surgent new products, services, risks? And how hard is that? What has been doable and unexpected as you've started the journey? Goodness me, we've got years to go of this yet.
So, and it's interesting, I've been following the chat function. There's some really interesting and really thought-provoking questions coming through that you actually don't see all that often. So I hope there are a few that we can get to. I think of it as, look, all organizations are in the process of changing right now. And it's happening at a, and has been happening at a slightly different pace. I mean, I don't think change for any organization is linear, but, when I think about JP Morgan, we have been actively working to build our capacity to, consider, integrate, manage, a combination of environmental, social, and governance issues, in terms of the way that we operate, but it's also how we think about setting forth expectations for our clients on responsible behavior. And, this is where, I've really seen, us invest in capacity. And I'll give you a couple examples. We have created 2 new banking teams that interface with our clients around sustainability and climate issues. One is a team called the Center for Carbon Transition, which covers clients in our corporate and investment bank as well as commercial banking businesses. We also announced a few weeks ago that we were creating a new commercial banking green economy team. This is actually like hiring bankers to grow their expertise and their knowledge to be able to cover clients. It's not about sort of growing an internal sustainability team. It's actually about having the right people and the right functions across the business. Similarly growing our capacity around climate risk management, and we've been staffing up there. Similar to Amit, having an environmental and social risk management function. It's making sure that you've got, the right people on the front line of the business, but also that you've got, people in risk, making sure that we have the internal legal expertise to, advise us on environmental, social, and governance issues and the linkages there. Many other places across the firm where we're growing our capacity. So it is very much like a real-time effort. And, what I find so interesting is, and coming back to the data piece, so much of the data that we tend to focus on is backward looking. I think the really exciting piece is to think about, how institutions start to get a better handle on, their forward-looking strategy and what that means in terms of investments that you're making today, how you see risks and opportunities arising in the future, and thinking about, how you present that story, I think is a really important piece to the conversation around, certainly how lenders and investors, over time evaluate, companies and how they're positioned for the future.
Yeah, I think that's great. And Amit, when you sort of reflect on that again with your very diverse landscape of maturity and geopolitical context as well. We've got a few questions in here as well around this balance of the risks in the pursuit of the E that then touch on, or perhaps inadvertently cause problems around the S as well. How are you managing internally your operating model risk frameworks, education of your colleagues in order to equip everyone to be able to manage this?
It's a bit like what Marissa was saying happening at JP Morgan. We've got sort of the dedicated teams and focus on this. And I've been in the bank a very long time and doing this particular role for 4 years now. And the pace of change over the last 12 months has been absolutely phenomenal. I remember going to our management team 3 years ago and presenting on what I was doing from an environmental perspective. We were talking about our coal policy, and the conversations I was having 3 years ago versus the conversations I'm having now are markedly different. This has really become part and parcel of all the conversations and discussions that senior management are happening, and that's fantastic to see. What we now need to do is really try and get that out into all of throughout the network. So it's not just concentrated amongst a few people. So we've got our climate risk team, we've got our environmental and social risk management team, we have our sustainable finance, we have our corporate sustainability team, and we all work really closely together. But we do need to find a way to really embed this wholesale across our organization. One of the things that's really forcing that for us is the Bank of England's climate stress test, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a UK regulatory driven exercise, so for 7 of the banks based in the UK, where we've been asked to work out on a forward looking basis the potential default that we have in our portfolio under 3 different climate scenarios. And we've been mandated to go out and talk to clients on a line by line basis. So we have very quickly had to sort of put our infrastructure and architecture in place to allow us to do this. So when the scenarios are published by the Bank of England in early June, we can run these portfolios. I think that and just the general sort of sentiment in the market and focus on ESG has really shifted the conversation. there is a lot of debate, particularly in Standard Chartered as well, around the justness of the transition. So to the question in the chat about, well, if you focus on the E, i.e. let's not put any more fossil fuel power plants up in anywhere, well, those people in those markets, they don't have access to reliable power. So we have to make a trade-off at some point between no power or dirty power. You know, it's easy to say when you've got access to power at the flick of a switch, you know, depending on where you sit. And so these are real concerns that we have to come across. And so we spend a lot of time debating the clients that we finance, the transactions that we will undertake because of this particular point. But not wanting to have a get out and say, oh, because we're an emerging markets focused bank, we can sort of take a slightly lackadaisical approach. We've made it a condition of our financing that everyone in our portfolio needs to have a transition plan by the end of 2022. So regardless of where you sit in the world, we want you to have a transition plan, and we want you to start reporting on it to improve the data quality by the end of next year. So, you know, we sort of acknowledge the tensions sometimes in focusing on the E and what impact that has on the S, but at the same time, we're committed to move the whole agenda forward.
We've just on mute there. So I'm going to say a final reminder to the audience to be submitting any questions that you've got on the chat. I think that you should also, because we may not get through all of these themes, if there are ideas that you would like Duncan and the team to be picking up on to build some of these conversations into future sessions, please do throw those into the chat as well as we go, because I know there's more to come. And in fact, I suspect the next one of this in the series, Amit, is around the climate tests, both the UK ones and the ones that have been happening in France as well. I'm just going to go through now and make sure we've started to touch on the questions that were asked. Actually, building on what you were just saying, Amit, there, we had a question from, I'm going to say it was Louise, around this balancing of, yes, Louise, thank you. This balancing of how do you, when you're assessing your clients, help them, and how are they now talking to you about this trade-off between investment in CapEx or investment that's required to grow their business versus the need for scarce funding to go into transition risk aspects. Marisa, let's start with you on that one.
I love this question, and I'm so glad that it was asked, because it is actually an issue that we talk about a lot with our clients. And, you know, I sort of think of this as, and in some ways, you know, climate is now such a dominant piece of the conversation, but, you know, at the end of the day, and I always say, you know, there are so many other factors that have to be considered alongside climate. And I increasingly say, look, climate solutions are not going to work unless they actually work for people and communities. And I know somebody else asked a question around, you know, fuel surcharges in France, where, you know, you sort of say, okay, you know, we're going to take a policy move and that's going to be good for the environment. But, you know, if it impacts people in a way where, you know, it doesn't work for them, you know, you don't get very far. So I think there is an opportunity and a growing need to think about issues, you know, certainly the intersection between the E and the S and the trade-offs there. But increasingly, you know, for companies, you know, it certainly doesn't make sense to pour a whole lot of capital into something if it is ultimately going to penalize your core business. And certainly if, you know, companies are being asked to invest in, you know, growing a part of their business where they have, you know, zero core expertise, and it ultimately in the long term makes no sense for them. So this is all about, you know, thinking strategically, and it means that I think transition planning is going to look very different for individual companies. And it, you know, you can't just say, you know, all companies in one sector are going to follow the same trajectory, because I think you're going to end up setting a lot of companies up for failure, and that's not good for companies, and it's not good for investors. So this, I think, ultimately requires a strategic approach, and it is going to take an individualized approach in some cases. You know, it also means that I think there may be cases for companies and investors that there are going to be, you know, nearer term capital investments that will have to be made, where it might take years for those ultimately to pay off for investors. And that is something I think, we have to, go in eyes wide open around that and think about what are the trade-offs that we're willing to make. Because, not every green investment is necessarily going to have a positive payoff. So we have to be really careful and strategic about the decisions that company management makes. And, investors need to be aware of a lot of those trade-offs as well.
Thanks, Marisa. And Mervyn, we had a question actually for you that I want to kind of build on with what Marisa has just said there. So there was a question for you from Matthew asking what proportion of ratings actions over the past 5 to 10 years would you say have been significantly driven by ESG factors, and in what direction? Matthew was particularly interested in sovereigns there. But building that then in with what Marisa has just said, how far and how fast are the ratings frameworks going to have to move in order to accommodate some of the aspects we've been talking about here adequately and consistently enough for fair comparative values?
No, it's a great question, and I'll maybe answer it in reverse based on what Marisa has just asked, and then kind of give a bit more on the statistics side, because I think when people first came to us and asked us how we're incorporating ESG into credit ratings, I think they were assuming that we need to start changing the credit rating criteria completely. And I think that's not the case, because I think the key is actually finding the links between these ESG issues and the credit rating criteria and variables that we assessing. So how does ESG affect profitability? How does it affect cash flows? How does it affect the financing flexibility of an entity? And so Marisa mentioned that it's very sector dependent, and that's absolutely something we found out. And it's been clear that our sector analyst team have to upskill their expertise on some of these regulatory changes, on things happening with things like climate stress tests very quickly. And I think actually one thing I would add to Marisa is what we've discovered is it's not always a financial trade-off and a sustainability trade-off, because quite often this is forced. So if we take the automobile manufacturer sector as an example, the fact that the industry is moving towards EVs and there's a huge focus on it, that's more of a question of, okay, we are moving a world where emission standards for vehicles are going to be higher. There are going to have to be these strategic shifts, and EVs are going to have to be part of it. And what we have seen is some companies have been more affected because moving towards EVs takes a huge amount of cash. You need to invest in R&D, you need to invest in plants, you need to invest in new infrastructure. And what that means is if you are starting off with a weaker cash flow position in the first place, it's going to be more difficult and more costly for you to do so. You're going to have to find ways to finance, you're going to have to find ways to actually implement that strategy. And so when we've looked through all of this and we think about the credit impact, so this is absolutely why we designed the ESG Relevance Scores. That's very much to focus on giving our analysts a way of indicating when ESG issues influence the credit rating. And so like I mentioned, for corporates and financial institutions, it's around 20%, mostly driven by governance issues. For sovereigns, it's a little bit more complicated because it depends on how you answer the question, because governance is important and it's a weighted part of our model for, like, it's one of the highest weighted, is the highest weighted variable in our model, because historically things like rule of law, institutional quality, all of those things are very, very correlated to credit ratings and credit assessments. And I think it's a little bit careful with this stuff, because when we talk about things like governance quality, it's also quite correlated with income levels and other factors that, again, contribute to the credit quality of a sovereign. On the social side, similarly, things like the Human Development Index, human rights issues, press freedoms, all that stuff is part of that kind of the variables that are analyzed. And so it's important to kind of, from a social perspective, and we have seen that materialize in a lot of times where there's social unrest that suddenly are triggered when societal issues are not managed by a country, leading to subsequent rating actions. And so for sovereigns, the way that our model shows, actually, S&G influence 100% of sovereign ratings, but obviously it's how much that becomes an important question then.
Okay, thank you, Mervyn. Hard to believe, or not perhaps, it is now 5 minutes to the hour and we're pretty much out of time. So what I would like to do is just ask all of our panelists for their final thoughts to wrap up for today before I hand back to Duncan. Patricia, I'd like to start with you because everything you've heard today feeds into the ability that you see our clients responding on the regulatory and disclosure frameworks as well. So Patricia, your final thoughts and areas of focus you want to leave people with.
Yeah, I think, great discussion, and clearly I think challenging times, but also exciting times, because we're seeing this shift towards ESG becoming a key element of investment activity. And as I said, going from risk management to more evaluation factor, I think that is a positive sign. And so as to the regulation, I appreciate there's a lot of uncertainty out there at the moment still in Europe, where we have the new SFDR and the taxonomy. But I think the idea to sort of make people change their behavior by having them disclose properly what they do and make products a little bit more comparable is generally, I think, a good approach. That's where I would leave it for now.
Thank you, Patricia. Marissa, thank you so much for your candid discussion and sharing of your thoughts from within your organization as well. Final thoughts for our attendees.
There are so many. This has been a really great discussion. What I would say, so I was just thinking, I did another panel somewhat recently where the moderator asked a question in a final speed round, and the question was something like, what do you expect the banking industry to look like in 2040, let's say 20 years from now? What is ESG going to be? And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I think ultimately in 20 years, maybe even in 10 years, we may get to a stage where ESG isn't even a thing anymore, because it's just sort of part of what we all do. Like that's the ideal, where it becomes sort of fully integrated and seamless, that you don't actually need to pull it out anymore to, sort of make clear what, companies and investors are doing. I think we're a long ways away, but, in my view, I think that's ultimately where we need to get, where, all financial products, services, decisions like this just really is a part of sort of how companies and financial institutions do business. So that to me is ultimately, that would be ultimate success in my view.
There was a lot of robust nodding on the panel to that point, Marissa. Amit, your final thoughts as we move to close.
I'll be super quick. I mean, I think I agree with everything that the panelists have said, and I think it's been a great conversation as well. I think the one thing I would like to see is I'd like to see move from words into action. So, we've got all the commitments, we've got all the alliances. Let's really do something about that. And one thing I've sort of said before is, in the race to net zero, nobody wins unless everybody wins. So I'll leave you with that.
Fantastic. I'm going to invite Duncan to come back onto screen. I want to, first of all, Mervyn, thank you for that fantastic outline that really got us moving there, and some really great perspectives that you brought to bear. To all of our other panelists for bringing their expertise and insights to this group, and to everyone on this call for a fantastic series of questions actually, and thoughts, which I'm sure will stimulate you, Duncan, and the team on some of the further sessions as we go forward. So huge thanks to everybody, and Duncan, to you.
Yes, well, look, let me start by saying a huge thank you to you, Kay, for so brilliantly moderating that session and for covering so much ground. You did a brilliant job, and I suspect we'll be calling on you again at some stage in the future. So, and thanks very much to our panel for being so open and giving so much of your expertise. It was a terrific session, and we'll be unpacking a lot of these issues over the sessions that we're planning over the next 6 months. And finally, a huge thanks to our supporters for making this series possible, to Debevoise, to Fitch Ratings, and to Letter One. We are very grateful for your support. So everyone who was on this call, thanks for joining. And Keep an eye out on the BAB website for the timings of the next sessions. Thanks all very much.